Okay, so just a quick completing the square question that we can just rip through. For 8b, it says x squared minus 2x equals 1 is the question, or the equation, and we're supposed to be solving it, so finding out what x is, by completing the square. And we've already got the equals 1 on this side, so we don't have to worry about that. But what we need to do is figure out what we have to add to this side of the equation in order to make it a perfect square. So if this, and we'll just leave the 1 over there, but we're going to have to do the same thing to each side of the equation. So whatever I do to add here to make this into the format where it's x something squared, I have to do that to the other side to make sure that it's equal. So I look at my middle term, and it's negative 2, which means that this number is going to have to add to itself to become negative 2 because FOIL. And so I'm going to divide this by 2, and I get negative 1. That means that I'm going to have x minus 1 squared as my perfect square. In order to create that perfect square, I need to have the number that goes here. So I'm going to need to square negative 1, but be careful. If you're using your calculator, make sure you put brackets around the negative 1 before you square it. Otherwise, your calculator is going to hear your question as negative 1 squared. So it reserves the negative till it gets the answer, and then it puts the negative on there. So if you want negative 1 squared, you've got to put that in brackets. And that's going to be equal to positive 1. So we end up adding a positive 1 to that side as well, which means that when we fill this out, 1 plus 1 equals 2. So that's kind of the tricky little arrangement step that I'm hoping you guys are following. If you have questions about that part of it, then message me and let me know, and I'll go through it more slowly, use color, whatever it takes. Once we get to this point, then all I'm doing is simplifying the equation to isolate for x. And it's x minus 1 squared, so the best way for me to move on with that is to take the square root of each side. And when I take the square root of this side, it cancels out the square, and I'm just left with x minus 1 equals the square root of 2. And then the last step that I have to do is just moving this 1 over, and since it's a negative 1, I add it. And the way that your book likes to write it is the number first and then the radical. So it ends up being x is by itself now, and it's equal to positive 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. If I wanted to find the actual numeric value of this, I would make an x equals 1 plus root 2, and I would put that in my calculator and get the decimal answer. It's going to have a decimal because root 2 is going to be an irrational number. So you're going to have to round it off. The other one would be 1 minus root 2, and then you would plug that into your calculator and get that numeric answer, which is going to be a negative.